If I were to ask you what you think of when you hear the word sober, what would your response be? I imagine some of you, if not all of you, would probably think, well, it means not to be drunk, not to be intoxicated, to be in the right frame of mind, and your judgment's not clouded. And, you would be right to think and to assume that that is what sobriety means. It means that there is nothing getting in the way of you making good, rational decisions. Consuming large amounts of alcohol or doing illicit drugs has the ability to stop that. But I want to focus on what it means to be sober-minded, which is a term we find in the Bible that talks about much more than just being abstinent from intoxication, from drinking, from smoking, from anything. And while that's important, that is important, sober-minded carries with it a much bigger meaning, because we see a lot all around us. We see a lot of people who just really are not being sober in their thinking, meaning they truly do not take things into consideration that they should. I work with inmates in the mental health world, and so many of them are in jail because they made choices without sitting down and realizing what they were doing. Many of them are there on drug-related charges. Some of them are there on charges related to an action that they did before thinking about it. Some of them are there because they chose not to do what they were supposed to do and are now paying for it. Sober-minded goes beyond just being sober from drugs and alcohol. It also means to be sober as in making sure that we have got our minds straight, that we are realizing and that we understand, hey, if I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing, I'm going to get into some trouble. But sober-minded really should also drive home for the Christian how important it is to be sober-minded concerning the judgment, concerning our salvation, and concerning the way we live. We sing the song, "They'll know we are Christians by our love." But I wonder sometimes if we kind of stray from that a little bit. Do people know we're Christians by our love? Do they know we are Christians by our conduct? Do they know that we are Christians by the fact that we are being sober-minded, that we're not just throwing caution to the wind and doing whatever feels right or what some people would say comes natural? Because if that's the case, how can they tell the difference between us and from someone who claims no connection or lifestyle to God? We have to know the difference. But part of knowing that difference is being sober-minded. If people look at us and they don't see think about God or the church or Christ, then what are we doing wrong? Are we sober-minded to that? Or do we recognize that maybe we are not appearing synonymous with godliness? Well, if that's the case, there's a problem. Unfortunately, so many of us end up being sober-minded when the deed's been done, when it's too late, when we are now facing the punishment of our actions. That's how so many of my inmates are. They suddenly realize how bad of a mistake they made once they're in the shackles, the orange jumpsuit, and they're talking to me. They can't see their family members. They might get to talk to them for 10 minutes every Sunday. The drugs are no longer in their system, so they're thinking clearly. They're feeling the weight of being inside of a jail pod surrounded by other inmates, people that they probably don't want to be around, hearing about stuff they probably don't want to hear about, but they chose to be sober-minded when it was too late. You know, last week we were hit by a very powerful series of storms, even to the point to where tornado warnings were issued for areas within our county, because the meteorologists would notice on the radars that there was circulation going on inside of these thunderstorm cells. And anytime that's seen, that usually is a good indicator that a tornado is going to be. Now, while I don't think any tornadoes actually formed or touched down, we certainly experienced a very powerful weather event. Several trees in my neighborhood were down the next morning, including one limb over here in one of my own trees. Some people lost electric. Thankfully, I did not. Some people did actually experience tornadoes, maybe not necessarily where we are, but places up near Sandusky. A tornado touched down and destroyed some buildings. We've seen things like that happen. And isn't it interesting how we're not really sober-minded until the disaster strikes? Maybe we ignore the weather warnings. Maybe we ignore the sky. Maybe we don't take what they're saying on the Weather Channel seriously. And while that's not to mean that the Weather Channel can predict the weather every time, because they can't, what a shame and how horrible it would be to only be ready to take shelter when the storm drops right into your lap and destroys everything that you've held dear. Sometimes we read in the books of the Bible that people decided to be sober-minded when it was too late. Can you imagine what the people of Noah's day felt like when they realized they missed it? When they saw the water falling, coming down in buckets. The springs of the sea were coming up. Water was filling the earth in places it shouldn't have been. There stands the ark. And you'll notice in Genesis chapter 7 and verse 16 that when they all entered the ark, at the end of that verse it says, "And the Lord shut him in." Talking about Noah. Noah did not shut the door of the ark. God did. God shut it and he sealed it. Meaning the door was not going to open for anyone now. All that were on board the ark was all that were going to be allowed to come on board. I know they made a movie not too long ago about Noah, and it definitely was a very inaccurate film as it was depicting life back then. But I can't help but wonder if there actually were people knocking at the door of the ark. People screaming. People with children. Those who ignored 100 years of Noah telling them that this is going to happen and that we need to build this ark. That was when they chose to be sober-minded. Sometimes we're not sober-minded until it's too late. Sometimes the rain has to start falling before we realize we're in trouble. And at that point, sometimes there's no going back. You know, we have a lot of things that we're dealing with right now here in our own society. And sometimes I'm afraid we're not being sober-minded about those things. We're overwhelmed with all of the dialogue going on from both sides of each argument. I think we're getting overwhelmed by the amount of news coverage that we're getting on everything. I think we're overwhelmed by the fear that gets perpetuated by what they report and what they say. It's very hard sometimes, and we can all get very tired of just hearing the same things over and over again. However, being sober-minded is part of being aware. This is not to say that we are to believe everything we hear, because that's just downright, it's a bad move. We do need to know our facts. We do need to understand what's happening, but we have to also know our sources. If graduate school has taught me anything, it is knowing where you're getting your information from, because people like to misconstrue stories. Our media definitely likes to take a few liberties with details, so they put just enough facts in there to kind of reel you in on the overall picture that is completely incorrect. People who buy into all of that, that's not sober living. That's not being sober-minded. And I don't think there's any other way to put it. It's ignorance. It truly is ignorance. So, we're told in the New Testament to be sober-minded and to be vigilant. In fact, Peter was the one who wanted us to understand that. So in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 8, we see I think a pretty familiar verse, but it starts out with, be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Sober-mindedness involves being very serious about us, about our spirituality, about our salvation. If we are to give the devil just an inch, he'll grab a hold of it and try his best to pull. We see it happening right now. People are being pulled left and right, and Satan, no doubt, is rejoicing in this. Why? Because some people are not being sober-minded about it. They're being tossed to and fro. You know, another phrase that the Bible uses. We need to be sober-minded about everything we do. The choices we make, the people we associate with, the image that we give off. Because if we're not paying attention to those things, other people will notice. Our children will notice. Just as Mike talked about this morning, there are things about him that he sees that are just like his dad, and he never knew that. Now he sees it. He always said he wouldn't be like his dad, but yet the nature of being his father's son carried with him. The same thing will happen to your children. To the people who look up to us or the people that associate with us, we can influence them. But are we influencing them to be sober-minded? Are we influencing them to be holy and righteous? Or are we simply giving the impression of, I'm a Christian, but I still like to do this. I still like to have fun. There's no room for that with sober-mindedness. Sober-mindedness leaves no room for mystery. Alcohol and drugs leave you plenty of room for not being rational. Doing things that are ungodly and engaging in stuff like that, it leaves a lot of room. We can't have any room. As you move on this week, guys, I certainly hope that being sober-minded is part of your character and that people see it. And I hope that it's seen in me as well. And that's the words from the couch.